Thank you. Yeah, we can start.
Okay, so I work, yes, in suicide prevention, and we have a county-wide program called Prevent Suicide Today. And through the program, we offer training in suicide prevention and intervention. So in September of 2017, we trained 25 people to become trainers specifically in what's called applied suicide intervention skills training or assist. And from that point on, we've been offering pretty much monthly workshops to diverse community members in suicide intervention. So those are 2-day workshops where people learn the skills of really de-escalating the situation when a person has thoughts of suicide, and also helping them create a safe plan. So it is a process through a conversation, and also they receive certain tools in that training. It's a little tool that helps them remember some of the steps of intervention, as well as some of the questions to ask and um, notes to make for safe plan. So we've been offering that since 2017, and then we also have a short training. It's about 60 to 90 minutes. It's called Suicide Talk, and that training is more on building awareness of suicide, explaining the problem of suicide, the statistics, and then it does also include a component of intervention, or at least the steps and questions to ask to help keep a person safe for now. So our intervention trainings and prevention trainings, they are not for long-term care of a person who is considering suicide. They are more for intervention here in the moment, keeping the person safe for now, and also connecting them to care and to resources. I'm also trained. Well, let me before I do that. Also so suicide talk training. We actually kind of revitalized it and rebranded it, and we did that specifically for our public school district.
Okay.
All of the public school district employees, they are required to receive suicide intervention training.
Mhm.
So based on feedback that we received from employees, and just the nature of the training, it's quite difficult for people, especially if they've been touched by suicide, to, sometimes to take the training. So in order to make it more trauma sensitive, we rebranded it and called it a safety and resilience training for the school staff. And we we address suicide prevention by discussing upstream approach and offering people the skills for self-compassion. Um, and then we address the midstream approach intervention component, where we offer strategies for intervention, and the downstream or postvention, that's where we offer resources.
Okay.
I have a webinar developed for the school district, and you're welcome. I can send you access to that. And then another training that I don't know anyone else locally who offers it, but I've been offering it. I'm trained. It's called Safe Talk. So I know it may be confusing. Suicide Talk, Safe Talk, Assist. Safe Talk is a 4-hour training. Basically, it's kind of a middle between the shortest one and the longest 2-day
No.
one. So through those workshops, we basically teach people. You can think of it as this model. It's called TALK, TALK. So T stands for tell. means tell the person that perhaps you notice something about their behavior or appearance or language that is not typical for them. Basically, that you notice that they're maybe being more sad or they look different. So by doing that, you acknowledge that you notice that's been a change. Or maybe sometimes you may not even notice external indicators, but you may know of a person, you may know that they've been going through something difficult, some kind of loss, whether loss of a partner or loss of a child, loss of a job, loss of a house. So you start the conversation by acknowledging that you see that. The next step of the talk model is actually asking a person directly and clearly, are you thinking about suicide? Which is effective intervention component and is a part of all interventions.
Okay.
In fact, I'll mention this resource just in a minute. So TA ask a person and then L listen. So really allowing a person to talk about whatever they need to talk about. A lot of times people can kind of talk themselves out of the thoughts. But a lot of times it's not about trying to fix their problems, but just being there and listen. And K of the talk model is about keeping them safe for now, which includes identifying if they had a plan. So what, when, how, if they have the means, how can we remove the means, whether it's the pills or the guns, and also connecting them to resources, perhaps being there while you're making an appointment with them to whether connect them to their primary healthcare provider or their counselor, or finding a counselor with them. And also, so there are two types of connections or resources, personal resources. So maybe connecting them to more friends or family members, acquaintances, and professional resources. So that would be counselor or therapist. So that's a very brief description. If you wish, you can go on the website. It's called Be the One. B, and so it's like BBETHE number one. So Be the One two TO. Here, I'll show you.
Okay.
1, 2. And I think they describe quite well. They describe some of the steps, some of the 5 steps. Here, I'll just put it in the chat box.
Thanks.
So that's suicide intervention. And I've personally done, I don't know, a lot of trainings. I probably trained, just me, over 5,000 people probably.
Wow.
Just a lot.
So, have you noticed any common areas or reasons for people going in this direction?
Do you mean direction of training or a reason for thinking about
Suicide
suicide?
and thinking about suicide and being in that state.
Yes, and that's part of the training too, but it's not usually one factor, it's usually multiple factors. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of social determinants of health. It's a more public health term, but really it's about a person having weaknesses in multiple areas in their life, and sometimes something dramatic happens and they are unable to cope. So they could have financial So number one contributor, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is relationship problems. So about 48% of people who are thinking about suicide have relationship problems, and other contributors include legal problems, financial problems, job loss, health problems. So a lot of times people have chronic diseases or mental health problems. and also problems with law enforcement. But ultimately, you can just conceptualize under the idea of loss. So
Okay.
sometimes it's a loss of a loved one, a loss of a job, but sometimes it's a loss of a dream, even, or hope. Let's say they were hoping to get in college, or hoping to get somewhere in life, and then it just collects, and of course, anxiety and depression are contributing factors to suicide. Um, and the person usually just starts feeling quite hopeless. Most of the time, people actually don't wish to die, but they just want their pain to end. So they find that as a way to escape the pain. But most people who are thinking about suicide, ultimately, they don't want to die. They just want the pain to end. So I don't know if that helps.
No, of course. That's interesting because you mentioned chronic diseases as also one of the cases. So if you could tell me more about that.
Yeah, of course, when people experience any sort of health loss, it can also contribute other areas of their life, so job or relationship,
Mm.
their function. I don't have specific data right now, and it's
Of
probably just
course, of
something
course.
that can be looked up for individuals with chronic diseases. But a lot of times, cancer patients may consider suicide, or even people with disability. And this is something that, again, needs to be looked into closely about the statistics wise. Um, so something that I just thought about, and I haven't really thought about that before, but I've been studying and doing more work on trauma. And what I mean by that, trauma as a result of adverse childhood experiences. So that includes abuse, neglect, all sorts of also all sorts of violence, even witnessing violence, poverty, um, be racism, right? So, what research is showing that people who've experienced 5 or more adverse childhood experiences, it's also called ACEs, they are more prone to having chronic diseases. So, like diabetes or a heart disease. And what that means that in addition to people having chronic diseases, we also need to look at their history and the history of their traumatic experiences.
Okay.
And when looking at
Hmm.
suicides, again, it's not just because a person that got diabetes. Well, a person usually gets some kind of illness a lot. I mean, not usually, but a lot of times because they maybe eat unhealthy, which is tied to how much money they make, and which is also tied to how much education they have, and which is tied which neighborhood they grew up in, or um, so things like that. Okay.
So,
And all of it, well, not all of it, but a lot of it also boils down to chronic stress. As you may know, chronic stress is linked to a lot of health and mental health problems. So individuals who are in a constant state of chronic stress um, can experience suicidal thoughts.
so from your experience, what role do people around that person play in this sort of situation? Like,
Say it again, I'm sorry.
so what role do people around them play, like their friends and family? How important are they in this situation?
Yes, so social engagement is a critical factor in interventions, and one of the biggest part of intervention is including safety net, basically including safety net individuals into your safe plan, meaning literally reaching out and making a list of individuals including your family and friends who can check on you, whom you can engage with socially. Something that I've been recently exploring and studying, it's called polyvagal theory, which it's kind of going off the subject, but it talks about just the way our body holds trauma and our bodily reactions, and social engagement plays a huge role in a person's ability to build resilience and regulate their nervous system. So there is this concept of co-regulation when you are with people who offer you a sense of safety, and when you are with people whom you trust, and when you have peer support. So these are important elements in creating both trauma-informed and trauma-safe environment, which to me also means suicide-safer environment. And one of the important components, especially when it comes to suicide prevention, is to, if a person is considering suicide, is to make sure that family friends are involved, and to the point that it's not just that we told them, but to the point that they can be informed and actually have conversations with individual and check on them and literally ask that question regularly. Do you have thoughts of suicide? On a scale from 1 to 10, where would you say you are with your thoughts of suicide? So actually equip them with skills to be able to have those conversations. And it's when people are not talking about it, that's when it becomes problematic, because a lot of it is also associated with shame, and what sustains shame is silence, as you actually attended our workshop. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but
So, what are the emotions at that time for that person when they're thinking about this and when they're going through this trauma?
yeah. So a running theme is shame, guilt, and blame. Those are big ones. A lot of times, person may be dealing, like I mentioned, with anxiety and depression, and but you can think of all the myriad of difficult emotions. Sadness, loneliness is the big one. Experiencing isolation, hopelessness, sense of hopelessness, um, desperation. So just a lot of negative. But I think it is important to address the fact that probably 9 out of 10 people who are thinking about suicide are also ashamed of having those thoughts, and that's why they are not openly sharing having thoughts of suicide with others, because they think that it's shameful or something is wrong with them, where in fact a lot of people have thoughts of suicide, or a lot of people at least once in their life thought like, I just don't want to be here, life sucks. And it's that idea of what we resist persists. So if you resist your own thoughts, then they will grow, and if you don't talk about it, then you become stuck. You become stuck in your mind and in your body with your own thoughts and feelings and emotions. So I think for me, when I even teach classes on suicide prevention, or really any classes at this point, when I teach health and wellness or mindful self-compassion, I need to be, or trauma informed interactions, I need to be very aware that things that I say about wellness or illness may evoke a sense of shame in a person. Let's say if I teach wellness class, people may start feeling ashamed, I don't exercise enough, or I'm fat, or I'm unhealthy. When I talk about suicide, people may feel ashamed. Oh yes, I've had those thoughts too, and they're not willing to share that. So we really need to make it accessible. And so people feel vulnerable a lot of times when we talk about the subjects. So how can we make this vulnerability, normalize it, and say that other people feel this way too. Depending on the group dynamics, I may ask, anyone here knows someone who's been affected by suicide? Usually I don't ask, is anyone here who had thoughts of suicide? However, in our 2-day workshop, we have a confidential questionnaire, and we do ask if you had thoughts of suicide in the past 2 weeks or in the past year. And a lot of times, more than one person does. And a lot of times, about 50% of people are willing to say that they have thought about suicide at least once in their life. So just to normalize it and destigmatize it. I just heard about a research specifically on trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, which also can be contributors to suicidal thoughts. But there was a research done in the military specifically that those members of the military who had high levels of stigma around mental health, they were also more likely to get post-traumatic stress disorder. And those who had low levels of stigma around mental health were less likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder after a traumatic event. And it actually makes sense because if you again don't talk about the mental health problems, then you are less likely to be socially engaged and receive the help that you need and process your thoughts and feelings. And if you have less stigma, then you're more likely to reach out for help or talk about others, and therefore have opportunities to process your emotions.
So they have an outlet basically
Mhm.
to vent it or talk about it, whereas
Mhm.
people who have a stigma, they don't have any
Yes.
outlet. So now that we have spoken about the mental state of a person at that moment, once they go through it and they don't follow through with their plans of like the suicide, and they get like positively transform and cope with it, hopefully, because they aren't doing it. So how is their life after that? Do they still have those thoughts? Is it like a recurring thing? Can people be not thinking about it ever again? Are there things to do that as well?
Yes, this is a great question. So research tells us that 90%, 90% of people who attempted suicide and survived never attempted suicide again.
Oh, wow.
And as far as having thoughts of suicide, some people have recurring thoughts, and some people may have recurring attempts, which may also be tied to other underlying mental health conditions. A lot of times, if and when a person does reach out for help, when they receive medication they need, let's say if they do have mental health conditions, a lot of times a person is able to cope, learn some coping skills, um, and they also learn that when they do have those thoughts again, all they need to do is reach out for help and not feel like they're alone in it. So
Okay.
for me, for example, I in my earlier 20s had thoughts of suicide on and off. I did not attempt it, but I did have the thoughts, and I was very ashamed of them too. And that was before I knew anything about suicide prevention. And then this past year, uh, going through some hardships, I noticed that I had thoughts again, and I went straight to my counselor and I reached out to my friend and then another friend and just talked about it right away, uh, just because I saw the danger in that. Um, it is important also to mention that our brains are able to learn new behaviors, and there is this concept of neuroplasticity, meaning that in other words, neurons that fire together wire together. So when we do learn and practice, let's say, new ways of doing things, we are actually able to learn the new skills and shift from behaviors that are harmful to behaviors that are helpful. I mean, even when looking at people who struggle with addiction, they're able to recover. And
Mm.
sometimes people, let's say, who have alcohol addiction, they may still say, I'm alcoholic in recovery for the rest of their life, just just because they're remembering that and knowing that they maybe could have go back to the addiction, but because of the skills they learned and the ways they've been able to rewire their thinking and their impulsive behaviors, they've been able to to
Control.
to start living differently. Um,
So, have you had any experiences with working with people with disabilities?
so yes, we in fact work. So we work with Gateway Community Service Board, and they are our local community service board behavioral health provider. And in our suicide intervention classes, we often have peer support specialists. And a lot of times, those are people who have mental or developmental or physical disability. Usually, it's around mental health disability, and then maybe as a result, they had some other disabilities. Or developmental disability. So it's very effective to have a peer support specialists in those intervention courses, because they also learn the skills to where they can intervene with people like themselves and people they relate to.
Hmm.
Um, I've also, I believe, I did that with Life Inc. I did a short presentation on suicide prevention and resilience. So it it I think it's definitely something that individuals themselves need to learn, because then they realize they're not alone in this, or that thoughts of suicide are common, and learning the ways to reach out for help. And also, it is important that the caregivers and friends and family of those who struggle with disabilities also have the skills of intervention and also know the resources, knowing where to reach out for help and knowing your limits. This is where I can, this is my path in intervention. Let's say maybe you can ask a person if they're thinking about it, maybe you can offer a listening ear, and then maybe you can connect them to services and then check on them or be there for them in whatever capacity that may be for you. So
So, like, not totally related to this, but during one of my interviews, I was told that how important a role of a family member is at that time. But it's not always that they understand the disability and the problems that person is going through. So, how do you solve that problem?
so so if you mind reframing that, so you when you talk to people.
So I'll tell you. So if a person gets a disability at a later stage,
Yeah.
and his family understands he has a disability, but they don't really know what that person is going through
Yes.
because, of course, they haven't had the same experience. So how can you train them to understand this?
I think so. Yes, the short answer is yes. At least not to understand the felt sense of their experience, but to help understand the common challenges that people in those situations encounter, and common yes, health, mental and physical health challenges, and the ways how a family member can be supportive to the person who is struggling or suffering due to a newly acquired disability. So yes, I believe in training, because that's what I do, and a lot of times people do need the tools. So, for
Yeah.
example, I work with Parent University. It's a local nonprofit organization for parents who perhaps don't have education or who are from low wealth backgrounds and communities, and who have kids, and some of the kids may have disabilities, some not, just wide range of parents. And Parent University, it's for parents to receive all sorts of educational components on finance management, health management,
Mm.
sometimes even literacy, right? And emotional well-being, physical well-being. So I offered a couple of classes, I believe, to Parent University, but they have a wide variety of classes, and absolutely it improves parents' knowledge and skills in how to support their children. So I think the same can be said for individuals who are supporting family members with disability. We also have a local organization. Well, we have Hospice Savannah, so that's where individuals who are near death, that's where they spend the rest of their lives. And Hospice Savannah offers um, groups for caregivers and for family members, either who are grieving or who are um, taking care of the individuals. Um, and I think that's valuable. I think what is valuable is to provide caregivers with the skills and tools and understanding they need to give the best support they can, considering all of their abilities and all of their skills. Give the best support they can to the person with disability, but also to give them the tools and skills to support themselves. And because they will encounter that caregiver fatigue, and they will have moments of desperation, and sometimes even caregivers themselves may have thoughts of suicide or may just feel like this is too much. They may have even secondary trauma which results from witnessing someone suffering, and your body is telling you that it's happening to you, because our brains are socially connected. And also a big part of that is helping caregivers to be engaged with each other and have settings and ways for them to connect and talk with each other, and also vent and talk about the difficulties they experience as caregivers, recognizing that other caregivers are going through similar problems, and it's okay sometimes um, not even want to be in the role you're in, but sometimes you're stuck, you know. And it's okay sometimes to go through emotions like anger, sadness, grief, disappointment as a caregiver. And it is important to provide caregivers with resources to, yeah, to support themselves.
Okay, so those are my only questions regarding this. Do you have any other thoughts about, like, because you know the topic that I'm working on, which is disability and acquired disability, and how that coping process that happens at that stage? So if you had any additional thoughts about that.
I'm not an expert on disability, but something I have been looking at is trauma and traumatic experiences that happen to people in childhood as well as in adulthood. And there may be something to look into as far as, mm, and I don't know if there's something about that. When a person acquires disability later in life, um, how many how many people acquire also post-traumatic stress disorder because of that, let's say? Or is it a traumatic experience for a person to go through a loss of ability to do something, right? And so when looking at that, it also helps us to understand how can we work with these people, not only to support them in the ways they need because of their disability, if they are blind or they have mobility issues or
Mm.
hearing loss, but also to support them as someone who's undergone traumatic experience, and perhaps offering even some interventions or counseling around trauma, and educating caregivers on trauma informed, trauma sensitive care, as well as resiliency building for themselves and the person they take care of.
So what I'm thinking of working in direction of is something like educating the people around them, because like I can't solve the problem at that stage, but I can at least create awareness amongst their friends and family, and that is the direction that I was envisioning this project in. So that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. Uh, okay, so I'll just shut the recording now because this is done.
Mhm.
I will be